This book explores the quite long history of international efforts to save the children in China and how those efforts both sparked a new global humanitarian imagination and precipitated some quite fierce political struggles to control the vast quantities of resources that sort of flowed into China on behalf of these children. So I thought I would start by talking a little bit about how I got into this particular topic. When I started grad school, studying humanitarianism from a historical perspective was just sort of becoming the sort of hot topic within the broader field of global history. And you can study humanitarianism from a lot of angles, but what historians seem particularly interested were sort of unraveling these historical connections between humanitarianism and imperialism. So as Western empires spread across the world, they supported humanitarian projects like orphanages and hospitals and schools. And as a lot of critical historians pointed out, these humanitarian projects, to an extent, provided a certain moral cover for imperialism, and they argued made children and other vulnerable people in these colonies and other imperialized spaces kind of dependent upon imperialist largesse. And at about the same time, there was just starting to be some scholarship on international adoption and child sponsorship as these programs emerged in sort of mid-20th century East Asia. They kind of made a modern version of a similar argument, right? That these adoption and child sponsorship in a way helped US Cold War foreign policy objectives by making the United States' expansive military and economic presence in the region look benevolent in nature. So, methodologically, these studies, mostly written by historians of the US or of Europe, rely on the Western language archives of humanitarian organizations in Europe and the United States, which means necessarily they reflect Western perspectives on sort of their own economic, political, or moral objectives in carrying out these programs. I think it's a really important, interesting body of scholarship, but as I started to read and reflect on this, I thought, on the one hand, these scholars are very critical of these Western humanitarian organizations for not always taking into account the agency, perspectives, and desires of the recipients of their aid in places like Asia and Africa. But on the other hand, if we're only researching from the organization's perspectives in the United States or Europe, aren't we reproducing this assumption, right? That it's only the perspectives of these would-be rescuers that matter. And so what I set out to do in the adoption plan was to ask a different question, right? To ask how might this history of humanitarian aid appear differently if we were to research it from the bottom up, right? From the perspective of the recipients of aid in China. Now, you might ask, why China, right? Why not Africa? Why not Latin America? Somewhere else? And it's a good question. I have two answers to that question. I have an honest answer and I have an intellectual answer. And I'll start with the honest answer. The honest answer is by the time I came to this topic, my background, my language skills were in Chinese history, right? This was the project I was equipped to write. But there's also an intellectual answer that I'll try to defend in the talk today is also an honest answer, which is that a lot of humanitarian programs that got started in China end up spreading all around the world, particularly in the post-World War II period. So at a very high level, right, what do we learn if we re-narrate the whole global history of humanitarianism from the bottom up, right, from Chinese perspectives? What new do we see? And what I found is that I think we really learn a lot about some big historical transformations and what humanitarianism is and how it works that either got overlooked or maybe incompletely understood, right, if we're only focusing on Western perspectives. And so I'll focus on three kind of interrelated transformations. One is the globalization of humanitarian aid, which really takes shape in China during the late 19th and first half of the 20th century. And then I'll look at how this globalization of humanitarianism in turn requires its personalization through new programs like international adoption and child sponsorship. And then conclude with how when we focus on these bottom-up perspectives, we really get a new picture on the politics behind these humanitarian aid programs. What we realize is that, in fact, it was often the recipients of aid in China, rather than faraway donors, who were best able to control both where the money was going and what kind of political narratives were attached to it. What I'm gonna try to do in hopefully less than an hour today is to sketch out the sort of alternative global history of humanitarianism, but to do so through the stories stories of 4 particular Chinese children whose stories I think can illustrate different key phases of this transformation. And I'll start with the birth of global humanitarianism through the story of a boy named Kuo Hua. So Kuo Hua was born on Hainan Island in South China in 1934, and when Japan invaded Hainan early in the war of resistance against Japan that flows into World War II, along with his 2 older brothers, he fled north. And it's a pretty sort of tortuous, circuitous journey, but they end up in an orphanage a couple hundred miles north near Guangzhou Bay that's funded by the National Association for Refugee Children, the biggest child welfare institution in China at the time, the Zhanzhe Ertong Baoyuhui, which I'll come back to in a minute. So the reason I know all of this about Kuo Hua is because he wrote it in a letter. This letter that you see here that he sent to a woman named Hilda in Auckland, New Zealand in January 1941. Now, if you're keeping score, Kuo Hua was like 6.5 years old at the time. He actually didn't write out this letter in his own hand, although it's in first person, but as he quite candidly admits at the end of the letter, one of his older brothers, who was with him in the orphanage, helped him write it. And Hilda had sponsored, they called it adopted, Kuo Hua through this international child sponsorship program run by the NARC. And earlier, she had sent him this letter saying, I'm not quite sure what name I should call you, but I have adopted you in answer to Madam Chiang Kai-shek, the First Lady of Nationalist China's appeal at the time. And she concludes by saying, I would just like to take you in my arms and give you a big hug. There's a lot going on here, right? There's a lot to unpack about sponsorship, about adoption, about war. But I wanted to start by taking a step back and asking, how did it come to be that a woman like Hilda in New Zealand would be interested in caring for a child like Kuo Hua in China? And I think the answer to that question takes us through this kind of 100-year story about how a new kind of global humanitarian campaign had taken shape in China. To zoom back out for a minute, as sort of I noted at the beginning, a lot of the early history of humanitarianism is very tied to colonialism. So you have projects where people in Britain are donating to humanitarian projects in British colonies. People in France are donating to projects in French colonies, etc. It was actually quite rare, right, for these humanitarian projects to expand beyond imperial boundaries. So in a lot of ways, the moral universe of early humanitarianism isn't the world, it's the empire. At the same time, something quite different was happening in China. And in the book, I make sort of 2 arguments for why China in particular emerges as this early site for global humanitarianism. The first has to do with semi-colonialism, and the second to do with the global Chinese diaspora. So to start with semi-colonialism, right? Unlike, say, a place like India, right? China is not colonized by any individual power, but rather you have a whole bunch of foreign powers who have economic interest in China and signed unequal treaties with China. And so due to these sort of colonial governments' embrace of an idea of colonial benevolence, often honored in the breach, when something like a famine happens in India, it's expected, right, that the British colonial government will step in and help. They didn't always actually do it, but there was that expectation there. In contrast, when a famine or humanitarian crisis happens in China, no foreign power, right, acknowledges any particular responsibility to do something about it. And so what you instead see are these private, what we'd now call international NGOs that get a lot of small donations from people all across the world, sort of coming together to fundraise for causes in China, in part because no colonial power acknowledged this as their responsibility. I think just sort of a good early example of this is really one of the first big international NGOs, the Holy Childhood Association, founded in Paris, and they support Catholic missionaries doing a lot of work with mostly infant girls in China. And without any government support, they do these kind of individual fundraising campaigns. They look familiar today. And by the end of the 19th century, they're getting donations from a really impressive swath of the world, right? From all of the different powers that have economic interest in China and a lot of their sort of formal colonies around the world. Fundraising on a geographic scope that you really don't see anywhere else. So that's one of the reasons. The other is the global Chinese diaspora, and particularly elite Chinese Christian women who'd built small communities and countries around the world. So if we come back to the NARC, this organization that Hilda had used to adopt Kuo Hua, the way it worked is they had a group of elite women headed by Song Meiling in Wuhan and then in Chongqing. And they would reach out to their diasporic connections, right? Largely wealthy Christian Chinese that they knew in countries like Indonesia, in the United States, in New Zealand, in Australia, and elsewhere, and ask Chinese people abroad to sort of take this child sponsorship program and advertise it to their local communities. So if you look at sort of where the money is coming from in these early years, it really maps on to where there are these communities of elite diasporic Chinese. And so for these 2 reasons, right, semi-colonialism and this quite adept at fundraising Chinese diaspora over this kind of 100-year period, right, from the Opium War to the Pacific War. You see this new kind of global humanitarian campaign emerge in China that is voluntary, it's private, it's global in scope, and I think, as we need to acknowledge, often grossly inadequate in practice. And it's this kind of program, right, that brings someone like Hilda to sponsoring someone like Huohua. But this globalization of aid kind of causes a problem that I've recently taken to calling the everyone, everywhere, all at once problem. If we sort of accept on its face, right, this humanitarian ideology that all people everywhere in the world are equally deserving of sympathy and help, then it's really hard to decide, right? When you have different humanitarian campaigns bombarding you from all across the world, right? Humanitarianism itself doesn't really tell you where to direct your limited money and your limited attention, right? You can't alleviate the suffering of everyone everywhere all at once at the same time, right? So how is someone to make these kind of decisions? I think that's the problem that the NARC faces, right, as they're trying to get women like Hilda interested in kids like Huohua. And so that leads us to the second phase and the second story, what I call global humanitarianism's intimate turn, the story of a boy named Qi Ming. And the story starts kind of similarly. We have a woman in New Zealand named Gladys, who in December 1939 writes this letter, a quite long letter. This is just page one of like a 7-page letter to a boy named Qi Ming in China. She says, "It will be strange for you to receive this letter from someone in New Zealand." And then she talks about this child sponsorship program, and she concludes by saying, "This, our first letter to you, is to welcome you into our family." So both Gladys and Hilda were participating in a humanitarian program that at the time is called the Adoption Plan for International Child Sponsorships. You have foreign sponsors paying for children to live in these orphanages in China, and then trying to build these personal relationships, right, through the exchange of photographs, of letters, translated letters that often used familial terms of address, and sometimes gifts as well. And this is kind of one of the antecedents of modern child sponsorship campaigns. And child sponsorship quickly becomes the most successful private humanitarian fundraising mechanism in the world, and it remains so today. The largest private humanitarian fundraising program. And so if we take a look at letter to Qi Ming, I like the first sentence. I feel like Gladys is kind of self-aware, right? She acknowledges that this is gonna be a little weird to get, right? She acknowledges she doesn't know much about him, but claims to be his foster mother. And she's not wrong. If we go back to Huohua's letter that his brother helped him write, he actually acknowledges, right, when I was playing outside and when someone came to give me this letter in picture, at first I couldn't tell what was really going on. But nevertheless, both sponsors and kids seem to really try to make this work. By the end of Gladys's letter, she says, "Now we think of you as if you were our son. Indeed, we shall always be thinking much about you." And if we turn to Huohua's letter, he starts with a little bit of trepidation, but he ends with pure joy. He says, "After listening to many friends' explanations, my mood started to improve slowly. Took him a while. It turns out you've adopted me as your foster son. This made me very delighted." So I think the adoption plan was really at a forefront of this broader sort of process that I identify in the book as global humanitarianism's intimate turn, right? This idea that we can use new transportation and communication technologies to build these personal ties between donors and recipients across cultural boundaries, across language boundaries, and across great geographic distances. It's incredibly successful. If you look at the post-war years, like 1945 to 1949, kind of due to compassion fatigue, due to the war, the end of the war, overall humanitarian fundraising is plummeting, it's going down. It's really only the adoption plan that is skyrocketing up at the same time. And I think this is so successful because it solved the everyone, everywhere, all at once problem, right? Sponsorship gives a woman like Gladys a reason to donate to one particular child, right? And to keep donating despite the near infinite number of worthy causes fighting for her attention. So in a lot of ways, it's the globalization of humanitarianism that necessitates the personalization of humanitarianism. But then actually making this work under conditions of global war is a pretty hard process, right? They've now got to deliver on this promise of building personal relationships across these boundaries. But organizations, they certainly don't lack for trying. This is another organization, China's Children Fund, that had this monthly magazine where they would try to train kids to be able to write these letters. Also pretty self-aware. They acknowledge this is a pretty hard task, right? It's hard enough to write letters to family and friends in China, let alone to write letters to a foreigner. And then kind of each month, they would have different advice that the kids could follow. I particularly like this piece of advice saying Americans like detail. They're very direct. If your sponsor says they have headaches, you can can go ahead and ask about the headaches, right? You don't need to use these conventional stock phrases like they would in Chinese. Something like, I have heard recently that your honorable body is indisposed. In Chinese, it was 今闻贵体为何. And so they could train the kids in letter writing. And then they also relied on translation as a way to massage these kind of awkward letters. So this is another example that I found quite interesting. A child wrote this letter, talks about the routine, and then he says, I only regret that I am slow-witted by nature and that my progress in both my studies and work lag far behind. Maybe that sounds appropriately humble in Chinese. I'm not sure. In English, it certainly sounds a little bit off. Might even make his sponsors wonder why their precious donation is being used on this kid with not a lot of natural aptitude. And so what do? In the English translation, they just excise the offending sentence, right? We have classes all morning, learn sewing in the afternoon. I hope you'll pray for our progress. So they can train kids on letter writing, they can massage them in translation, but actually delivering these letters is a whole nother matter. So to come back to the protagonist of the story, Qiming, he actually never received this letter. A few months later, the NARC in Chongqing wrote back to Gladys saying, we got the letter, but Qiming has already been reunited with his family, so we're unable to deliver it. This is only partially true. They did actually deliver the letter. I actually found the Chinese translation of his letter in the archives in Nanjing, and they even sent it all the way to the orphanage where he lived. It was the number 6 orphanage in Sichuan. But then the superintendent of that orphanage wrote back, as that child fled the orphanage back in October, and we don't know where he went, we're unable to deliver the translated letter. And so rather, telling the truth, right, that this kid had run away and they don't know where he went, they made up this white lie, right, that he'd been reunited with his family, this kind of happy ending. And this happened quite frequently. Runaway children was a big problem at these wartime orphanages. But a year and a half later, they actually did send back to Gladys a letter from her replacement foster son, this boy named Chen Shi. As far as I can tell, they always ask, but to me it feels like the practice itself kind of implies that Chinese children are just interchangeable, right, as objects of affection. And this was really driven home to me in the archives by another example of a letter written to a kid who was no longer in the orphanage. They'd already translated it, and you can see that they actually just crossed out the first kid's name, it's Cheng Guangfu, and wrote the replacement child's name, Yang Xueren, into the margins beside it. So he would have received this letter, right, with another kid's name crossed out in advance. So why even do this, right? If it's so hard to coordinate these programs during the war, why try at all? I think one is fundraising, right? These were very effective fundraising mechanisms. The other is politics. This is before Pearl Harbor, when China is fighting Japan alone and trying really hard to get help from the United States and from Britain and the British Empire. And so they saw these letters as a chance to tell China's story of the war, right? To expose Japanese brutality and sort of give this positive propaganda about the nationalist government. Some of the older kids really took this pretty far. Some of the older kids would write these very political letters where they sound kind of just like the nationalist textbooks that they would read at the time, saying, rather than suffer the oppression under the iron hoof of the Japanese bandits, we'd rather roam about the countryside, but then eventually, right, the great Madame Chiang Kai-shek came to our rescue. And so I think it was the nationalist government in China that really first appreciated how the personalization of aid, these letter writing programs, enabled them, right, to start using it for their own political goals, right, getting aid. But the nationalists would not be the last to make this realization. And really it was the communists after the revolution who would take this the farthest. So for that, I want to turn to our third story, the rise of revolutionary humanitarianism, through the story of a girl named Yin Ho. So on July 1st, 1949, Yin Ho wrote this letter to her foster mother, who was a woman named Esther in Worcester, Massachusetts. And it begins, I think, in a quite intriguing way. She says, it is too bad that we cannot speak, that we cannot open our mouths and speak to each other, but can only use this piece of white paper. But this piece of paper is too small for me to say everything. Would you like to hear more? Let me tell you. So what does she want to share? It turns out she wants to share how many positive changes she'd observed since the People's Liberation Army had liberated Shanghai in the previous month. She says it's been 1 month since the communists came, and we can see that things have changed. Right now, the farmers are getting rice, and the soldiers are no longer bullying the people. And then she goes on to be very critical of the US allied nationalists, who she says were dropping bombs over Shanghai. This is true. The nationalists were bombing Shanghai this very week. And she says, one of her classmates' homes was bombed, right? No one was killed, but everything else was destroyed. It was truly terrible. And so I think you can imagine, the foster mother getting this in the United States, probably been corresponding for several years, all of a sudden thinking, is everything I read in the newspaper, right, about the bad communists and the good American allied nationalists true, right? Now my foster child, right, is telling me a very different story. And I think this speaks to how the communists, in a quite surprising way, right? You might imagine that they would say these humanitarian aid programs, this is what the American imperialists do, this is what the nationalist reactionaries do, we're going to get rid of it. But they don't, for a number of reasons. One just being they needed the aid, right? They tried to transform this and make it serve their own material and ideological needs, something that's often called revolutionary humanitarianism, or 革命人道主义. And at the center of this is PLAN, now called Plan International, then Foster Parents Plan for War Children, which is a secular, pretty left-leaning humanitarian organization at the time. It grew out of the Spanish Civil War and these sort of anti-fascist United Front movements that moves into China in 1947 and starts sponsoring these more progressive, liberal humanitarian organizations that were often affiliated with the underground Chinese Communist Party as teachers and as employees. And so they end up funding 27 progressive child welfare institutions, almost all of which have some connection to the Chinese Communist Party through these same child sponsorship programs. And so for PLAN and also the CCP, they try to conceptualize this as a new form of people's diplomacy of 人民外交. And they're quite explicit about it in their Chinese documents. They say we need to take these dull greetings and ordinary pleasantries and transform them into people's diplomacy and revolutionary and international propaganda. And they actually give a lot of detail on how they want the kids to do this. They give all these topics that the kids can write about, things like the glorious achievements of the People's Liberation Army, or and you can contrast that with the rule of the nationalist reactionaries. But they're also very aware that the politics of this is only going to work if the kids continue to maintain these friendly, intimate ties with their, at this point, largely American foster parents. Since they talk about this need to promote sentiment across national boundaries, right? 国际间的情感. One of the many terms that I sort of merged together in this book is this concept of global intimacy. And they also know this is quite hard, right? I think we think back to Ian Ho's letter. I feel like she did a pretty good job of doing what they want, right? Of writing a letter that is, in their terms, soft in tone, but firm in substance. 外软内硬. But not all of the kids are quite so good, right, at writing these letters. Sort of by 1950, they've consolidated this into their sort of concise motto for children's letters, which is use the heart to influence the mind. 从感情到理性的宣传法. So Ian Ho is pretty good at this, I think. Not all the kids are, and they have this big problem with children going off script. And they talk about this in internal documents. They say, we don't have enough control over the children's letters, right? Their political skills are good. They've got the message ideologically. Their propaganda skills, not so much, right? And this is starting to cause people to drop their sponsorships, right? And if the money's cut off, none of this has any meaning. And they actually give some specific examples. They say these children are decrying American imperialism and lecturing their sponsors, and my favorite phrase, displaying the erroneous tendencies of excessively harsh language and excessively leftist ideology. So what to do? Again, they turn to translation. This time is a tool of political censorship. There's a lot of examples, but one of the most obvious ones I found in the archive is this kid who wrote this letter in August 1950, praising the Soviet Union. He says the people in the Soviet Union are very happy. It is only under Stalin's leadership that they're able to live in such happiness. Don't you agree, American foster parents? And even though PLAN had a pretty liberal donor base relative to some other organizations, they're probably not Stalinists. And so what do? They massage this one quite a lot in translation. The corresponding passage gets translated as only our belief that when the government is in the hands of the people are able to enjoy their happiness and peaceful living. On the other hand, not every single kid is writing propaganda letters. I would say a significant majority, despite all of the advice and training they're getting on how, this is a form of people's diplomacy, kind of writing these innocuous missives that have nothing to do with politics. One of my favorite, this is from a girl at the Xiangshan orphanage in Beijing, who takes one of her letters to write home. I'll read it in Chinese. It's 山自有风，拿在手中，由人来借，等到立冬. Not great, not Li Bai, not Du Fu. But I think it's pretty cute for a 13-year-old girl. And to me, what this shows, right, is that these programs ultimately rely on children's participation, right, to be able to do their international propaganda work and to be able to do people's diplomacy. And some of the kids simply opted out. These letters still got translated. They still got delivered. And then the Korean War really changes everything. A lot of the older kids in these orphanages, maybe 14, 15, 16 years old, left to go join the People's Liberation Army. And a lot of times the difference between an orphan and a soldier was not age, it was just what you were doing with your life. And some of them wrote letters explaining to their foster parents why they were leaving the program. This is one from a boy named Wenchuan, written to a family named the Macaulays, where he says, "I'm very grateful to you for everything you've done for me, but now I'm joining the army, I'm going to serve humanity," as he puts it. And he says, "I hope you continue to send me letters from their biological children, who he calls his foster brothers in Chicago." And it turns out 14 months later, Wenchuan actually got sent to the battlefield in Korea, where he found himself fighting against the United States, right, against the compatriots of his former foster parents. And in 1951, as the PLA was retreating back north toward the 30th parallel, he was caught in a napalm attack and never heard from again. So to the Macaulays, he might have been a foster son, right? But to these American warplanes dropping napalm bombs over Korea, he was still simply the enemy. By the Korean War, this idea of using global intimacy to ameliorate global politics, it kind of collapsed, right, against the harsh realities of war and the new ideological battle lines of the Cold War. And in fact, by the time he died, these programs have been quickly cut off. In the context of the Korean War, first the US actually froze Chinese assets in US banks. China responded in kind by freezing American assets in Chinese banks, which meant these American-funded humanitarian programs no longer had access to money and were quickly shut down or taken over by the Chinese government. Which leads us to the fourth and final story, the story of Erxiang and the rise of Cold War humanitarianism. So Erxiang, at really the same time as some of these other children, is in a very different kind of institution. He was in an orphanage funded by the American Oriental Friendship Association, run largely by Southern Baptist American missionaries. So this is an explicitly religious program. We're far more conservative than planned. And in fact, the particular orphanage where Erxiang was called Chang Memorial Children's Village, Zhongzheng Fu You Cun, which was located in the former residence of Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang Kai-shek in Chongqing. So they moved to Chongqing during the war, and when they go back to the capital of Nanjing, they donate their former residence to this orphanage Erxiang resides. So very clearly affiliated with the nationalist government and much more conservative Christian projects. And so during the Korean War, Chinese communists, who had been really open, right, to this idea of revolutionary humanitarianism, or 革命人道主义, begin to rethink that position, right? Initially, they thought children could be people's diplomats, spreading their message abroad. By the Korean War, it came to seem to them like these children were economically and also emotionally dependent on China's new ideological and military enemy, the United States. And they kind of belatedly embraced this more traditional Marxist critique of humanitarian aid, calling it this form of cultural invasion, or 文化侵略, and saying that these programs are trying to deceive, corrupt, and instill a slave-like mentality in the Chinese people. Particularly, the programs sponsored by the adoption plan really came in for target in the Chinese media and by the Chinese government. You have these adoption plan funded orphanages being criticized for giving this false ideological education to children that's making them resent their family and even forgetting their fatherland. Chang Memorial Children's Village, where Erxiang lives, really becomes at the center of this big sort of blow up around American humanitarian aid to China during the Korean War. These sort of local officials from the Chongqing municipal government, they go out, right, to take over and investigate this orphanage, and they're pretty shocked by what they find. First, right, they see children still carrying around these letters and pictures from their former American foster parents. Just like the report said, they're saying they're looking down on their fatherland, losing respect for their nationality, despising their fellow compatriots. They actually find one boy who tells the investigators, "I would rather be an American's dog than a Chinese person," right? Some really ugly rhetoric. And so they say, in just this way, what the adoption plan actually did was it harmed the thinking of our children and caused them to forget their own fatherland, right? And the stakes of this are really high. The United States and China are literally at war in Korea at this time. So the emotional loyalties of children feel very existential, right, to the communist government at the time. And this ends with the investigators taking over the orphanage and forcing the children to participate in this mass denunciation meeting, a 控诉会, in which they were asked to denounce their former American foster parents. And Erxiang was one of the first to speak at this meeting. It's recorded in municipal documents, where he says, "Before, I did not know that they had come to poison and deceive us, and I even thought that they had come to give us help and be good to us. Only now do I know that Saunders, the American, is an imperialist element. He insulted our dignity and poisoned our character," and he ends, "I truly hate him." And after each child spoke, they were actually asked to stand up in front of their classmates and teachers and rip up the letters, photographs they'd kept from foreign foster parents. And so one by one, the ripped remains of the adoption plan are literally accumulating by the fistful at the ground beneath their feet. And so what do these organizations do? They leave China, right? And they move on elsewhere to East Asia. And it's here that I think humanitarian aid becomes very closely mixed with Cold War politics. If we look at this one organization, China's Children Fund, still around today as Child Fund in Richmond, Virginia. 4 years later, I guess, in 1955, they completely redistributed where they were sending their humanitarian resources. And it's basically US Cold War allies in East Asia, Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, and Taiwan that are getting the bulk of the funding. And they started to quite explicitly talk about these programs in a new way, saying this is a way to build these emotional and effective ties between the United States and the children of our allies in East Asia. And so I think the clearest example of how politics, much more than humanitarian need, starts to determine where the money is going is the case of Taiwan. CCF, China's Children Fund, they wanted to open 2 orphanages in Taiwan. They asked this American missionary there to help them. And she writes back, the big problem is that there's just not a lot of need for an orphanage in Taiwan at this point. So there's these good extended family networks. If something happens to parents, kids get taken in by aunts or uncles or grandparents, and it doesn't seem like we need to put these kids in an institution, right, just because they're orphans. So why do it? The Cold War logic is very clear in the pamphlets that CCF used to advertise these programs. This one is called the most anti-communistic spot in Asia. It's referring to Taiwan. They call it Formosa at the time. And the messaging is not subtle here, right? Russia did not supply the rice in its child's bowl, nor did the communists in China. America supplied it. China used to be so central, right, to these global humanitarian aid programs, and by the Cold War, there's this kind of first decoupling of China from this new, now US-led global humanitarian order. So what happens to the kids in China? A lot of them face quite a lot of persecution. In the Mao era, there were these personal dossiers that were kept on all PRC citizens. And if your dossier had that when you were young, you were in one of these American-funded orphanages, now American imperialist-funded orphanages, it prevented people from getting jobs during the Cultural Revolution. There were persecutions, there were beatings, and there were actually a lot of suicides of kids who had grown up in, to no fault of their own, these American-funded orphanages, and now found themselves persecuted for that during the Cultural Revolution. On the other hand, a lot of the employees of these institutions, the Chinese people working for them, they had some pretty rare skills. They had good foreign language skills. They usually had connections with missionaries or others abroad. And a lot of them quite seamlessly transition. I think Song Ching, Madam Sun Yat-sen, is sort of the head of this, into the international propaganda industry, writing the CCP's English language programs like China Reconstruct. So almost the whole staff of the Plan China branch, the Chinese staff, ends up going to work for this magazine, which ends up becoming one of the CCP's primary English language propaganda outlets, targeting mostly the countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but also the United States and Europe as well in English and then in other languages. On the other hand, outside of China, right, starting in East Asia, but quite quickly expanding out across the world, the adoption plan for international child sponsorship becomes this enormous global industry. By the 70s, they've dropped the adoption plan part because it just sounds a little bit too paternalistic, I think, to contemporary taste. But child sponsorship becomes a multi-billion-dollar industry. And the last estimates I saw, $3-ish billion, supporting something like 9 million children in the world today. The promise, right, this promise that started in World War II China, right, of an intimate relationship with an individual child, really remains the most powerful private humanitarian fundraising pitch in the world today. So a little bit of conclusions, and I'll bring this up to the present. So if we step back out and think, right, what new do we learn about humanitarianism and its politics when we re-narrate the story right from the bottom up, from Chinese perspective? I think we see quite a few things. One is a different genealogy of the birth of global humanitarianism, right? The older story is that these were colonial practices that, Western empires were doing in their colonies and kind of gradually expanded out from that. I think what we see from the story is it was really Chinese organizations like the NARC working through the elite Chinese diaspora who first globalized humanitarian aid and detached it from sort of older ideologies of colonial benevolence. And second, I think we see this connection, right, between the globalization of aid and the personalization, right? Once any cause, right, and you can find out about any urgent humanitarian cause on Earth, it becomes so hard to decide where to donate. I think the real key innovation of these programs, right, was making them personal, right, giving these donors a reason to donate to one particular kid, often in China because there were no pre-existing colonial connections. And then finally, how this personalization in turn transforms the political possibilities, right? Once it's the people on the ground in China teaching the kids how to write the letters and telling the stories, they have much more power to shape the narrative, right? So I think in contrast to the sort of standard story that humanitarian aid is this vector of Western influence, at least in this case, it was often the recipients of aid on the ground, sometimes with similar beliefs, sometimes, in the case of the communists, with quite different beliefs, who were able to shape where the money was going and how it was understood politically. So I'll end up quickly by bringing this up to the present. There's kind of a around the world and back story here, where these organizations leave China, they go to Japan and Korea, and it's really in Japan and Korea where systemized legal international adoption, actually bringing children into your own families, gets started. Initially targeting the mixed race children of US soldiers and local women, right, in Korea and Japan. And this sort of story went, and there's a lot of debate about how true this is as mixed race children in these relatively homogenous countries, maybe they would face racism, not have such a good future. And so instead of the child sponsorship programs, they argued we actually need to adopt these kids, bring them back to the US. After all, their fathers are largely American soldiers. And then in the 1990s, right after the one-child policy, a lot of these organizations go back to China, this time not just doing sponsorship, but doing legal international adoption. About 160,000 children were adopted internationally from China as of fall 2024, when the programs were ended. And of course, from, I think, the sponsor or adoptee's perspective, these are totally different things, right? It's one thing to write some letters, send some money every month. It's another thing to adopt someone as a child, legally and emotionally into your own home. But from the perspective of the Chinese state, they actually serve a pretty similar function. International adoption was a way for the PRC to attract humanitarian resources to their own particular cause. There's often a mandatory donation, something like $5,000 to $6,000 to adopt a child from China, which really was transformative for child welfare institutions that were very badly funded at the time, and also provided some publicity efforts, right? Inviting foreigners into China to adopt a kid, often at the White Swan Hotel in Guangzhou, creating these connections with organizations abroad, like Families with Children from China, and then also often homeland tours, right? We're able to create these connections by introducing Chinese culture to Americans who might not otherwise be exposed to it. These slowed a lot, peaked in 2004, 2005, really slowed to essentially a halt during COVID. And just last fall, the foreign ministry in China officially announced that they are closing its international adoption program. So I think China no longer wants to be seen, right, as a country that needs to be a recipient of humanitarian aid. And instead what you've seen, I think, are some very tentative beginnings, right, of China trying to decide whether it wants to emerge as a humanitarian power in its own right. Reflecting back on the book and the present moment, I think one of the things I realized is how China's very long history as a recipient of humanitarian aid is shaping its kind of tentative approach to giving humanitarian aid today. Since the 1950s, China has been absolutely castigating, right, these humanitarian aid programs, be they private or public, as this tool of American imperialism. This language stays pretty consistent from the 1950s. You can see it in a lot of reports today as well. And so having done that, right, having invested so much domestically, right, to Chinese people, being like, these US aid programs are a sham, they're about geopolitics, they're not really here to help you, I think it's made China quite tentative to, at least on a large scale or explicitly, embrace humanitarian aid as a tool of its own geopolitics. On the other hand, and especially I think COVID is one turning point here, China's sort of very slowly experimenting, I think particularly in places where it has sort of strong ties or geopolitical interest, with providing more aid and encouraging its citizens to provide private aid through humanitarian programs as well. If China's own history is any guide, I expect they might find that the recipients of their aid have other ideas. So thank you very much. I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
During the Cultural Revolution, you said many of the recipients had to tear up papers, letters. Do you know of any cases for folks who survived reconnecting with some of their foster parents in the United States or other places?
I think in part because the timeline was so long. I haven't seen any cases in mainland China. There are a few in Hong Kong of people connecting with their foster parents, but there are these alumni networks that build out of these programs in the late 1980s and 90s. So during the Cultural Revolution, a lot of people committed suicide. It was a mark of shame, particularly if you were in the NARC. This was the 战时儿童保育会, affiliated with Madame Chiang Kai-shek, and they got called things like 宋美龄的小偷, like Madame Chiang's little spies. But then by the 1980s, they started to be able to rebrand themselves, in part because NARC was technically a United Front organization. Deng Yingchao and some prominent communist women were involved in a pretty minor secondary role. They actually did have one Baoyuan orphanage in Yan'an, but they started to re-narrate this. Deng Yingchao comes out publicly, praises the NARC, says it was this great humanitarian program, and gives permission for the people to survive, to start to reconnect around their shared experiences in these foreign-funded organizations. So there are alumni networks surrounding them in China, which has allowed a lot of the children who went through this to reconnect. They put out a lot of interesting publications about their experiences as well, especially in the 90s, could write quite honestly about their experiences during the Mao era. But I haven't seen any particular examples from mainland China where they've been reconnecting with people who would have already been middle-aged in the 40s or 50s.
The revolutionary humanitarianism where propaganda is being sent from China to the US recipients. China is also politically concerned that propaganda is going the other way around. Yeah. It seems to make sense to me that the adoption program is the safer, politically safer option where you just send the kid over and it becomes thoroughly assimilated, one fewer mouth to feed.
Right, there are these two-way kind of competing propaganda efforts. And whose narrative is going to win out, right? Is it the American, foster parents or other foreign foster parents who are writing in their letters, or is it the kids, whose letters often reflect the local politics at the time, right? Whether it's the nationalist, the communist, whoever happens to be there. One way in which it's kind of an uneven contest is that the children are required to write at regular intervals. By plan, in the late 1940s, it was actually once a month. It's an incredibly dense letter exchange. Whereas the foster parents, some write all the time, some totally ignore it. But if you look at the statistics just on the volume of letters going each way, there's way more letters coming from China because they're regularized and required, and way fewer letters coming from foster parents who may or may not lose interest and who are not being sort of coached in any way to make this political project. So just sort of the weight of the letters and the political content of the letters are way more on the child's side. But it's interesting because both sides were ultimately so uneasy about this. And who pulls out first is this kind of game of chicken. So Plan, this more left-wing organization originally, actually pulls its China program before they're kicked out of China. They have this kind of technical rule that in their charter, no aid is supposed to go through any government institution, and after 1949, all aid has to run through these sort of municipal institutions in China. And so they say, okay, we're using that as an excuse, we're pulling out. But then they go to Korea where they work through government institutions in Korea. So they're obviously being selective, but it was new, more conservative leadership and Plan. They were facing some kind of McCarthyist persecutions back home in the United States who say we can't take these political risks anymore. On the other hand, China's Children Fund, a more Christian, conservative organization, they decide to stay in China till the end. They're arguing very explicitly, it's not the kids' fault who their government is. They really embrace this idea of humanitarian neutrality, and they even make a lot of compromises to allow for sort of new PRC-approved textbooks, to go into these orphanage schools. And so it's a more conservative organization that stays until they're kicked out in 1951. But I think you can see on both sides this real uneasiness about whether they can actually sort of win the propaganda battle in these programs.
Could it not see itself as a potential actor in the sponsorship? Could they see that as a way to alleviate sort of the emotional emptiness from a childlessness society?
It's a really interesting idea about China sort of adopting child sponsorship for all the same reasons today. And it makes some sense to me. I haven't seen it in the PRC, but where you do see it is in Korea and especially in Taiwan. When I was out in Taiwan for 4 years, and you would see World Vision and Child Fund advertising, sponsoring a kid, usually in Africa or Latin America, all the time. It's become quite popular in Taiwan, sometimes Christian populations as well. So it's an interesting idea. And especially in the US in the 50s, they very much marketed it in this way. There's a ton of pressure, right, to have this ideal nuclear family and have kids in the US. And so a lot of their marketing in the US was targeted at childless women. They'd be like, hey, you, woman who's a doctor or a nurse or a school teacher, you too can experience motherhood through these programs. So a lot of the advertising was very targeted at demographic realities that were emerging in the US at the time that are now emerging in more pronounced form in East Asia. So there's some interesting parallels there. As far as I know, this is still very uncommon in the PRC, but it's expanding in East Asia in general. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Before the 1970s, when China started to recognize the West, before that, what was the percentage, if any, of children leaving mainland China.
So in the early period, right, actually a lot of people who were sponsoring a Chinese kid are writing to these organizations being like, I've been doing letters 2 or 3 years, like, can I really adopt this kid and bring them to the US? The answer was always no, because of the Chinese Exclusion Acts, right? Before 1943, you legally could not bring a Chinese kid to the United States, and the restrictions were so low up until 1965 that there was just no legal way to do it. China doesn't actually open an international adoption program until 1991. The one-child policy starts to go into effect in 1979, and so you start to see this phenomenon of a lot more infant girls being abandoned because even though their parents would, of course, want to keep them if they could have multiple kids, they feel so much pressure to have a son to carry on the family line as an heir. Throughout the late 70s and the 80s, almost all of these kids get informally adopted by other Chinese families, right? People want to get around the one-child policy and bring another child into their home. You have hundreds of thousands of informal adoptions per year happening in China in the 80s. Very little overcrowding of orphanages. It's a very sad phenomenon, but it's sort of a phenomenon that's being solved by the society itself through these informal means. And in 1991, China does 2 things. One, they crack down on domestic adoptions by saying an adoption is also going to count against the one-child policy. So if you adopt a kid, you can't have a biological kid. If you have a biological kid, you can't adopt a kid. Because they think people are using this to get around the one-child policy. And it's in that same law that they open up international adoption. So essentially replacing domestic adoption with international adoption, which never reaches the scale of these earlier informal domestic programs and leads to more crowded orphanages as well. So it's not till the 1990s that international adoption is sort of a solution to a problem created by a deliberate government policy of the PRC to crack down on domestic adoptions that, to a large extent, had been taking care of the issue of abandoned infant girls.
Where was the big money? Was the big money in sponsorship? So did the big money go to orphanages? Or did the big money go to whoever was running the adoption?
In terms of scale, right, child sponsorship, what we used to be called the adoption plan for international child sponsorship, is astronomically bigger, right, than international adoption. You have something like 160,000 total children adopted internationally from China from the early 90s to today, and you have millions of children today who are in sponsorship programs, or someone is sending letters and money overseas. And those have been huge programs going back to World War II. So I think a lot of attention gets paid to international adoption because it's such an interesting phenomenon, and it's such, a powerful transformation, right, for the families involved. For the people involved, it's absolutely transformative in a way that sponsorship, probably isn't, right? You're just sending letters, you're sending money. But in terms of the scale of the money, the scale of the programs, child sponsorship is astronomically bigger. A critique of child sponsorship has always been the really high overhead costs, right? Particularly early on, photographs are so expensive, cameras are so rare, even letter paper for these kids to write letters was incredibly rare. So you have women in New Zealand or the US writing these 7, 8 hand-paged letters, like they're really trying to communicate everything a child who grew up in their family would know. The kids are writing back usually short 1-page letters, not necessarily because they didn't want to write longer, because they were only allocated 1 piece of paper. So in terms of thinking where the money is going, a lot gets sucked into overhead in child sponsorship programs. All of the major child sponsorship programs have tried to wean themselves off of sponsorship in order to get a greater portion of aid into these countries, but the donors leave. Sort of once they open this kind of Pandora's box of this promise of personal connection. The NARC tried it during World War II, child funds tried it, World Business tried it. When they back off the child sponsorship programs, people stop donating. What has changed is how they distribute the money in these countries. Early on, these were going to particular orphanages, usually not particular kids, right? They would say, they would take the money from one sponsorship, put it in the orphanage pool. Although they would sometimes, people send like a special gift, like, I'm gonna send a birthday, card with $10. That would go to one kid, and it created these really big inequalities. Because, a family in Chicago might send $20. In a poor, village in China during the war, that could equal, the salary of a worker for a whole year. And so are you really gonna give that to one kid in the orphanage when, all the employees at the orphanage would have never seen that much money in their lives? So it created these kind of interesting moral dilemmas and inequalities about, okay, this was earmarked for an individual kid, but giving that much money to a kid in an orphanage when all the other kids are going without, doesn't make any sense. And so these organizations have grappled with this for a while, and beginning in the 60s and 70s, they shift to more of a community development model where the money is still coming in through child sponsorship, but they're channeling those funds into these broader community development programs designed to sort of help communities become self-sufficient. A lot of debate on how efficient that's been, but I think after all that wrangling about how you distribute the money from sponsorship, that's sort of where the private aid industry is settled, is use sponsorship to fundraise, deal with the overhead because it's the only thing that works, and then try to put that money into these broader community building programs.
Did you see any of that in whether they're targeting the diaspora and trying to get them to be siding with the communists or siding with the nationalists?
For the most part, the answer is no, but let me explain why. So during World War II especially, so much financial burden is being placed on ethnically Chinese people abroad to contribute to the wartime efforts to fight Japan. It's all called donations. A lot of this functioned more like an extraterritorial tax because Chinese people were still so excluded from, say, the American economy at the time. Most Chinese workers are working for Chinese employers, many of whom were tied to the government. So the national government is actually telling Chinese factory owners or other business people, just dock 10% of all your Chinese workers' pay, send it back to China, call it a patriotic donation, and we'll use that to fight the war with Japan. So by 38, 39, this has been going on for a while, ethnically Chinese people abroad are being so financially squeezed by these sort of appeals to, you're an overseas Chinese, give back to the motherland. Really not a lot of people except the wealthiest have extra money to give through these adoption programs. And so what they instead say is, in addition to sending money back, also go be a fundraiser on our behalf. Go find your non-Chinese friends in your communities and use the adoption plan to get non-Chinese people interested in this cause of children in China as well. So it's really interesting how during World War II, the diaspora goes from a source of funds back to China to fundraisers attracting non-Chinese people to be interested through these humanitarian programs in China. There's some exceptions in Southeast Asia. There were a few individual wealthy business people who were, thought this was a cool idea and wanted to, also sponsor children. What's also interesting is that they almost always wrote in English. I think it's sort of demonstrating their cosmopolitanism. So letters were actually still being translated. These Chinese business people in Singapore or Jakarta who had grown up in China, but I think kind of wanted to demonstrate cosmopolitanism by participating in these programs, including Europeans and Americans, living abroad. So much less so with overseas Chinese directly participating in the program. They kind of, functioned as these middle people connecting organizations in China to broader global bases of donors.
Okay, thanks again for Jack.